Members of the public advised our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton, temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and media may also be audibly, visually recording this meeting. Madam Clerk, any changes to the agenda?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, no, there are no changes to the agenda today.
Motion to approve the agenda, please, as presented. Moved by Councillor Paul, seconded by Councillor Collins. All in favor? Carried. I see no declarations of interest, or are there? We'll move on to approval of the minutes. We're looking for a mover and a seconder to approve the minutes of the December 6th, 7th meeting. And we're looking at the rate budget and tax capital budget. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Johnson. All in favor? And any opposed? Seeing none. Presentations. Mike Sigarik, Interim City Manager, providing a presentation respecting Report FCS 18096.
Good morning through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. It's a nice backdrop and some nice singing in the background here this morning. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I have a short presentation. This morning, just a recap of some of the highlights and some of the questions that arose from last week's capital budget presentation. Just a reminder that the 2019 to 22 capital budget endeavors to support a number of Council's strategic priorities, including increased investment towards our West Harbour development. You may recall that the previous four-year multi-year budget represented $125 million in order for the project to be development ready. This year's multi-year forecast represents an overall increase of $37 million, bringing the overall investment to $163 million. With respect to transit, you may recall from last week that our four-year transit capital investment represents $400 million, of which $300 of that $400 million is earmarked towards provincial federal funding partnerships through the Public Transit Infrastructure Fund Phase 2. A number of investments surrounding growth and development around roads and underground services, including some of the projects that were presented last week through the rate-supported budget. Affordable housing, the continuation of the previous Council's commitment of $50 million towards affordable housing. In total, $8 million has been earmarked in 2019 for affordable housing. $7 million of the $8 million being funds dedicated through Council's poverty reduction and social housing program investment. State of good repair, a number of projects. I believe it's 77% of our 2019 budget represents investments towards existing assets, maintaining the life and quality of our existing assets. You'll recall that the 2019 recommended budget represents an overall investment of $226 million, which would require a 0.52% property tax increase to support the capital levy. That 0.52 would generate an additional $4.4 million annually in operating levy, and the 0.52 would represent an increase for an average household of about $18. As well, you'll recall last week we had considerable discussion around operating impacts from capital. The recommended projects do include additional operating impacts in 2019 and future years of $2.89 million and 24.24 full-time equivalent positions. And I'll have some additional information and breakdown with respect to the operating impacts.
Mike, Councillor Partridge on this slide.
Just very quickly, thank you, Chair. So, Mike, when we say $18 increase on the average residential property, what's the value?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I think it's $337,000 is our current, heads are shaking. So 337, just for the benefit of all committee members, that is based on the 2018 reassessed value. That number will change by the end of this budget process because we'll have a better understanding as to what the year 3 of the 4-year reassessment will represent for 2019. So again, the $337,000 represents this year's average assessed value, and that will change before we complete the 2019 budget process.
Thank you, Mike. So fair to say, and for those who are new to the budget process, so fair to say the $18 increase for the average residential at $337,000 is for capital only. And so for a home that's valued at $800,000 to $900,000, which many of our wards do have them, safe to say 3 times that, 2.5 times that?
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if it was, just to keep the math fairly simple, if you doubled it to $670,000,
right,
it would double. Effectively, it would be a $36.
All right, thank you. So I just wanted to confirm that was the ratio going forward. Thank you.
So again, for 2019, the recommended capital levy increase is 0.52%, and you can see the driving factors to the 0.52% is what we refer to as our traditional capital levy increase, principally for state of good repair. I mentioned previously that about 77% of our capital budget in 2019 is going towards maintaining existing assets. You'll see that in previous years that number represented about 87%, and going forward we will be returning back to a higher proportion of the overall spend being directed towards maintaining our existing assets. So again, 0.5% principally towards maintaining our existing assets, and a 0.02% increase in order to leverage some provincial and federal partnership funding for transit. Again, you'll recall last week we presented this information, just an indication as we move forward with multi-year budgeting, what some of the pressures are with respect to the capital budget going forward over the balance of our multi-year forecast, 2019 to 2022. Again, you'll see 0.5% for again what we describe as our traditional blocks and discretionary funds. You'll see that over the 3-year period, 2020 to 2022, again, an additional capital levy increase of about 0.25% to 0.5% in order to leverage some provincial and federal funding. Again, of the $400 million that's been earmarked for transit over the next 4 years, about 300 of that $400 million is earmarked towards potential federal and provincial funding through public transit infrastructure fund. That would require a local contribution as well. I mentioned previously that West Harbour, the last term of council, approved an overall investment of $125 million in order for the project to be development ready. You'll see before you, through the capital budget submissions, an overall investment of $163 million, which represents an additional $37 million. Some of the driving factors are some additional parking capacity, parking garage, an expanded parking garage, as well as some public spaces, public realm investments. That $37 million would represent some additional debt. In order to service that debt would represent some additional capital levy increases in 2020 to 2021. So again, just an indication of the road ahead as it relates to staff's forecasted capital levy budget. Just some additional information. I won't go through the table, but council in the past would have been familiar with this table. It just shows a breakdown of the gross and net, and just as a reminder for the new councillors, gross represents all revenue sources. It could include development charges, gas tax funding, reserves, what we refer to as WIPs in progress, works in progress, WIPs, and some other funding sources. So again, you'll see the gross and the net, and for comparison purposes, we just identify what the approved 2018 restated budgets represented and our 2019 proposed. And you'll see that information continues on slide number 7. I mentioned last week was in 2018 we paused on the parkland acquisition funds, and we are recommending that we proceed with earmarking additional $1.5 million for parkland acquisition in 2019. We're continuing towards a multi-year funding strategy for the city's contribution for Randall Reef, and again, we are nearing the end of our 10-year Emerald Ash Borer program, and you can see what the capital contribution in 2018 and 19 represent. I mentioned previously that we made some assumptions with respect to boards and agencies. You'll see in your agenda today, I believe agenda item 6.1 is a correspondence from Hamilton Police Services with respect to their 10-year capital forecast and their request. What was presented last week was what was earmarked in 2019, what was earmarked in 2018 for 2019, which is $400,000, and you'll see, again, as through agenda item 6.1, is some additional capital requirements requests from Hamilton Police Services, and I'll speak to those shortly. Hamilton Public Library have some additional requests as well. They're principally related to two projects, Valley Park and Greensville. You'll recall a number of correspondences with respect to Greensville, which is a multi-party community hub development that includes Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, Hamilton Public Library, and the City of Hamilton. And because of some budgetary pressures as it relates to bid prices, is that Hamilton Public Library are requesting some additional funding for that project as well as the Valley Park project. And further is, I'll just continue on. With respect to the operating impacts from capital, there were a number of questions last week with respect to what operating impacts from capital represent and the timing of those operating impacts from capital. If all of the proposed or recommended projects were to be approved, it would represent, again, about 24.25 full-time equivalent positions, as well as an operating impact of just short of $2.9 million. We've tried to break down the 24.25 FTE as to what would be required in 2019 versus future years 2020 to 21. So again, you can see the breakdown in full-time equivalents as well as the operating impacts, separating 2019 from future years. We've presented it in a different way on slide number 9. Again, this is not additional full-time equivalents or operating impacts. Just to give you a better sense as to what's driving those figures is an additional ambulance in order to maintain the service level for paramedics that represents about $670,000 and 10 FTEs. Some additional investments into our IT strategy, and that would represent 1/4 of an FTE and $40,000 in 2019, an additional $235,000 in 2020. Some additional operating impacts with the redevelopment of Confederation Park, again, about 3.7 FTEs and $291,000 in 2020, and some further development and expansion of our advanced traffic management system, representing 2 FTEs and just over $200,000. So again, just another way of presenting some of the primary projects that are driving the additional FTEs and operating impacts in 2019 and 2020. Just as a reminder, there were 4 companion reports to last week's agenda. The Shoreline Protection Program, which we discussed earlier this week, which represents a $150,000 investment in 2019 that is funded in our 2019 budget. I'd point out that the $6.8 million investment identified for 2020 is not funded within our funding envelope for 2020. So if Council wanted to proceed with that investment in 2020, that would represent an additional pressure in 2020. We would have to defer or park some projects or look to increase the capital levy in 2020. Valley Park Community Centre is, while the library is continuing on with their project, there was an opportunity to accelerate some future projects that's currently not funded in our 2019 budget. That represents $2.4 million. First Ontario Centre, you'll recall for the councillors who've returned, for the new councillors, there's an outstanding business item list for staff to report back in the coming weeks with respect to a scope of work as it relates to a vision for the entertainment district across the road. And that will be coming forward. One of the assets that needs to be addressed is the First Ontario Centre, and that companion report that identified a $70 million investment over 10 years or $34 million in the first 5 years of that 10-year forecast. Again, that is not funded within our multi-year budget. And finally, Farmers Market is what has been identified is about $2.5 million in investments over the next 2 years.
Mike, on this slide, and if I can pass the chair to Councillor Marula, very quickly, we only have for this year in our entertainment facilities a little less than $3 million. I appreciate the $34 million over the next 5, but did I hear or read recently that the $3 million, and that's for all the facilities, may not cut it due to some recently exposed issues, particularly First Ontario Centre? Through you to whomever. It may be a cause for concern with respect to events and so forth.
So through the chair, I'm not sure that we have Rome or Robin. Sorry, Ian might have the answer.
I know Rome's in the anteroom, so I'll ask him to come forward. But yeah, I think if I heard the question right, one of the concerns that we have is we've identified these issues, and it's difficult to know with any kind of certainty when you might see a catastrophic failure of something like the Brine line. So, Rome can add to that.
Through you, Chair. Rome, is there anything at First Ontario Centre? We have budgeted for all of our facilities $2.8 million for this year. I'm referring to slide 11, which speaks about the next 5-year $34 million funding. But did I hear recently that there's some potential cost that may come at us in 2019 soon with respect to the First Ontario Centre that exceeds what we're budgeted for this year?
Through the chair, we've identified that the brine lines are leaking. There's some perforation in there that could eventually affect the quality of the ice. It's not a situation like a light switch will turn off tomorrow, but over time it's going to affect the quality of ice. That building there is about 34 years and 34 years old. The brine lines are existing 34 years. It's past its life cycle and it does need attention. At some point it will require to be replaced, and it would be considered a catastrophic failure if it does stop. I couldn't tell you if it would fail tomorrow, a year from now. We're just bringing this information in front of you to say that it's past its life cycle and we're managing the risk, but there is a potential major risk there.
Okay, well, hopefully it'll hang in there in time for our deliberation and decisions going forward as a whole on all of our facilities. Thank you. I'll take the chair back. Go ahead, Mike.
And so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the reason why it's before you is in the context of that broader review that is still outstanding with respect to the entertainment district. This is clearly one of the principal assets that needs to be captured in that review.
Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And Mike, while you have this slide on the screen, I'm just curious on the shoreline protection, and we had that very comprehensive report from Dan and his staff the other day as it relates to climate change. I had asked earlier in the year about the establishment and the creation of a climate change reserve to assist in terms of funding these initiatives on an ongoing basis, knowing that they're now happening on an annual basis. And I'm just wondering if that recommendation and report comes back during the budget process, or is that something that will come beyond our deliberations?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, let me just first ask Brian if that reserve was created through our, no. So it would come back through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I would expect it would come back through our reserve reports where we provide council an update as to the status of our reserves, and we identify which reserves are unsustainable and need some attention. I expect we would create, as per the direction from council, create that reserve. We'll have to look for a funding source for that reserve. Traditionally, funding sources for reserves are from operating dollars, where we budget a contribution to reserve through the operating budget. It could be from a third party or from a senior level of government. We've had reserves that represented the $100 million contribution from the province of Ontario for our sewage treatment plant expansion. So we'll have to look at some operating impacts. Given that it's climate change, a very broad issue, there isn't necessarily a program, a specific program that may represent a direct link to a contribution to the reserve. So we can report back with some options. Some options may include, just top of mind is, we could look at our investment income coming from our reserves and earmark some funds for that reserve, as well as we can look at year-end variances. The only challenge with year-end variances is that varies from time to time, and ideally we would want a sustainable level of funding being earmarked for that reserve. So again, in terms of the councillor's question, we would bring that information back. Traditionally, we brought that information forward in June, the reserve report, and there would be a recommendation to establish the reserve with a recommended funding source.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and specifically on this slide. Mike, Valley Park Community Centre is up there. What about Greensville? Greensville you've already referenced earlier the situation there in terms of the delay, but I'm just wondering about the Greensville.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Greensville, the additional funding, I'm sorry for flipping through these slides, I'll find Hamilton Public Library. Greensville represents part of that additional $720,000 ask for 2019. You'll recall it's been a bit of a journey with respect to Beverly and Greensville. Part of the challenge has been, as I mentioned previously, it involves three parties: the city as it relates to community space, Hamilton Public Library as it relates to the library space, as well as the school board, with respect to the school space. So we've had a number of efforts to tender the Greensville project. Each time there has been a budget pressure for all the parties, the principal party being the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. The first tender out for the school board, I believe, was 50% over budget. Yep. The second tender out was 37% over the budget, and we are now looking at a phased approach with respect to the school board, whereby the school board would proceed potentially with the development of the school and then transition the project over to the city and Hamilton Public Library in order for our two parties to proceed with our space. Having said that, the one variable now that is somewhat new is the provincial amendments to through Bill 66, whereby the city wouldn't have the same obligations as it relates to being signatory to the Carpenters Union. So that is an issue that may allow for, if that issue proceeds, that may allow for all three parties to come together again with one process, and we'll wait to see early in 2019 whether that represents an opportunity.
Yeah, depending on when it gets passed through the House. And so just to clarify, though, the public library figure that you've got up there for the library includes the city's community space, because it was separated out as Valley Park. And that's where my question is really stemming from.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, no, the $720,000 represents just the Hamilton Public Library ask, $280,000 for Greensville, and I believe $420,000 for Valley Park.
For Valley Park, okay. So the actual community space that the city is going to build is not in this budget for Greensville?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, no, it would be in the recreation
Thank you very much.
Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Just go back to the slide you had up there, please, Acting City Manager. Thank you. So, Mike, you briefly touched on it last week on the Emerald Ash Borer program. I got to believe this, if memory serves me right, this started with the former manager, Mike McNamara, which I believe he's been retired about maybe 4, 5 years now. If not today, then somewhere along the process, not only for myself, but for the new members of council, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we have spent millions on getting rid of all the emerald ash infected trees across our city. Very sad state of affairs, the tree canopy that was removed, but had to be, so that the larger scope of the city's treescape wasn't infected. I'd like to have some idea. Are we coming near the end? That's a lot of money every year. Are we coming near the end of the program? Outcomes? If not today, Mike, then please take that under advisement. Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, please.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I see Dan having his hand up, and I'll just say that traditionally that information has come forward through the departmental presentations.
Dan?
General Manager, please.
Yeah, that's correct. I'll have I'll speak to that within my budget presentation in January. I know Craig is going to be bringing forward an information report, and just for committee's information, 2019 represents year 7 of 10, and as it sits right now, it still looks like about a 10-year program.
Okay. I'll wait for the further, more detailed report. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mike.
Councillor Clark.
I think it was page 12. Yes. So I'm trying to understand the Hamilton Public Library Board projects. For Valley Park, for example, it shows 8.0 million, previously 6.9, and the ask is only 440. So is a portion now unfunded, or is the $8.8 million totally funded?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I can grab a book, but maybe one of our staff can grab a book. I expect it would include some of the reserve contribution from Hamilton Public Library or other funding sources, but maybe one of the staff can grab the detail sheet for that project to identify what the other funding sources are.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, you can go on to another speaker.
Sure.
And then just come back to me when we have the
Councillor
answer.
Ferguson. Thank you, Councillor. We'll come right back to you. Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you go back to slide 8? Go 9, sorry. Okay, so we're seeing situations now where we're making capital decisions ahead of the operating budget that significantly impact the operating budget. And here's an example where 10.25 FTEs is going to be an operating budget. And so in the past, I know in the rate budget, we've sometimes just said we're going to hold on the FTEs until we approve the operating. On the ambulances, we've added other ambulances in the past. Each ambulance takes 10 paramedics to operate it. And we haven't seen the ambulance, the paramedic presentation yet in their budget. I don't know whether this is once again being driven by offload costs, but are we able to, if early in January we approve the operating budget, put on hold the FTEs until we see the divisional budget presentations that impact the operating budget? And we saw it last year with Transit, 55 new operators that had to be hired because of management issues with 18% absenteeism. This is sort of a management issue also because it's offload costs. It's how you manage that. So, comments.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it's a very good question because this really does represent part of the challenge when you have separate budget processes. So why it's before you is the request for the capital investment, the vehicle, and in order to support the vehicle requires the 10 FTEs. So to the councillor's question is in the past, councils have parked either capital projects or operating impacts. With respect to the capital request, my recommendation to committee is consider approving the financing and parking the discussion with respect to the operating impacts and FTEs to the to the operating budget. Why I recommend that is if you do not proceed with, at a minimum, the financing for the vehicle and council approves the overall investment, we will have to draw from, for instance, our unallocated capital reserve to fund the vehicle. So again, in order to have a further conversation with respect to the complement and the FTEs and the operating impacts, my recommendation is that through this capital budget process, approve the capital funding and park it pending a future conversation with respect to the operating impacts.
Okay, so I can move that at the appropriate time. I don't know whether it's today or January. Probably today would work. Or would that be coming back as a staff recommendation?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it's something that council could move forward through a motion. The councillor could bring it forward through a motion. I see a note on my screen here that our next capital budget GIC is January 21st. So that could be brought forward as a motion to approve the financing for the vehicle and to park the operating impacts and complement to the operating budget process.
Okay, just so it doesn't, we don't get missed then, can you see any downside of moving that today?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if it's the will of committee to move that today, that's acceptable, and we would track that as part of our operating budget. You'll recall when I presented the overview operating budget, there was a section referred to as council referred, and we would capture that in the council referred section for further discussion through our operating budget process.
Okay, and I'm prepared to move that today, Mr. Chairman, just till we get this clear on to park the operating cost until after the operating budget has been moved, but support the financing for the capital for the ambulance in this particular case.
It can serve as a notice today. In all likelihood, unless by some miracle we pass the capital budget today, we're coming back on the 21st. So notice today, motion on the 21st, which times well with the presentation.
Okay, and of course, there's no downside to approving that amendment today. Although, through you two, Mike, would you like me to craft that or Brian to craft it? Just so we get the words right. It can be left as a...
So I'm going to go to the clerk, only because we're trying to pay attention more this term to time-sensitive issues, but the clerk also has something she wanted to say.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if you leave it as a notice today, that's fine, because I can actually prepare the wording and have it ready for the January 21st meeting when you do approve it.
Okay.
Because if you go forward and approve it today, you're approving the capital today for that. It's still going to go to the same
And I can
council meeting.
verbalize the notice of motion then you and I working on the...
I will make sure it's...
Fine-tuning that for the next...
Absolutely.
So if you come back to me, I'll do a notice today on that. And should I do something similar through you to Mike? We had that conversation about the $38 million for West Harbour, and that you would expect that would be compensated from $42 million that we'd get in revenue from the sale of the property. We talked about that last time. That's your intent. Some members of council suggested I put that in the form of a motion now because it's been talked about for quite a few meetings. And should I put that in the form of a notice of motion today too, to come back with the recommendation, just so we understand it better?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if I understand the question is whether a notice of motion would be appropriate whereby you direct staff to apply future proceeds from the disposition of West Harbour lands to reduce our debt burden.
Correct.
Excuse me, clarification, Pier 8 lands, West Harbour, Barton Tiffany, we're allocating toward payback to future funds, so more specific to Pier 8, I believe the councillors.
Okay, so I'm going to move both those, or put this forward to both today as a notice of motion, and then work with Stephanie on formalizing the motion for our next capital budget meeting. So that's all my questions.
Councillor Clark, can you indicate again? I think you get your answers now. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. So I'm looking at slide 12, and I'm trying to understand the variance between what is being budgeted, what was previously approved, and it looks like the ask doesn't add up to the variant, so it's a little bit confusing.
So through the chair, in Budget Book 2,
Valley Park Library expansion is in the book. So what they've requested, and they went through the board meeting back in October, was there's an additional, in net they're asking from the city of $440,000. So the additional money in 2019 was $1 million gross. And so now the grand total for the amounts previously approved in 2019 is the $8.099 million. And they are using some of their program reserves at the, excuse me, at the library, and also there's just some development charge reserves.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair, I still have a briefing scheduled for Valley Park because they're also wanting to look at synergies for the main plant if the library. So I'll do the rest of the questions with staff when I have that briefing. But if you can come back to me, I have other questions for the budget too.
No indicators right now, so if you're ready, go ahead, Councillor Clark.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the actual recommendations, and it talks about the funding the debt charges, and it spreads it out over a percentage for each of the next 3 or 4 years. But then the last line says, be approved in principle and revisited by council each budget year. So I'm a little bit confused now. What's the term for the debt instrument?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, what comes before you through the recommendation, and I'll have to review the recommendation, is the actual debt that is required pending council's approved 2019 funding envelope. And with respect to 2020 to 22, again, because council does not have the authority to approve future year budgets, we ask that you approve the capital financing in principle. And that is brought before you each and every year for ratification. So again, you're just approving it in principle as a forecast beyond 2019. You are not approving future debt obligations beyond what is required to support the projects that are approved in 2019. So for instance, if you have a project that requires debt financing, the term, I think that the councillor's question is, our typical terms are 15 years and 20 years. 15 years for those projects that are not significant in size and in materiality. So for instance, our wastewater treatment plant, given the expansion and average age, we assumed a 20-year term. With respect to some of our growth-related projects, we assume a 20-year term. But we are fairly, I would describe, fairly conservative in our debt issuances, where we try to align to a 15-year term, and the principal reason for that is to create some financial flexibility in future years, not to create too great of a burden beyond this generation onto the next generation. So again, it's typically a 15 to 20-year term. I believe I mentioned last week is that our last issuance was $110 million, and it was principally 15-year term, and we issued at 3.317%.
So it's a fixed cost for us, but we can vary it year to year depending on the financial situation of the municipality?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it's not a fixed cost in that the rate will vary. So you would have heard our Brett House, who did the global budget overview, kicking off our budget process, speak to Scotiabank's opinion that there will be 4 rate hikes in 2019. So I mentioned the 3.317% being our cost to borrow in 2018. If we were to issue in 2019, you can expect that some of those rate hikes will become a factor and will incur a higher cost to borrow. So again, it's not fixed in that sense. And with respect to the terms, again, we try to match the asset. If it is a significant project with a extended useful life, we may consider 20 years. And in one case, I believe the project across the road, we did a 30-year issuance with the project with McMaster, given the life of the asset and the term of our agreement. But typically, they're 15 to 20-year terms.
Okay, thank you. And so later on in the report, we talk about the digital office. So is the report coming to us about the digital transformation project? Is there going to be a formal presentation?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, our Chief Digital Officer, Andrea, will come forward with a description of the strategy. What you'll see in the 2019 budget is an additional investment for some of the work of the digital office. And that includes beyond the City Lab, which is part of our operating budget and funded from reserves because it's a pilot with the our institutional partners, the open data work, as well as working in collaboration with departments as it relates to opportunities to automate or to transition to a digital channel. So again, what is before you is for 2019 is we've earmarked $1 million. And we've also requested 2 temp permanent positions, and temp permanent positions are up to 24 months. That'll allow an opportunity for council to appreciate what the return is on that investment, and then we would continue to report back as to what the outcomes are from that work.
Yeah, that's good to hear because I'm cognizant of the FTE request, but I also have a basic understanding of the digital transformation project and the potential for improvement for our system-wide issues, and not to mention some efficiencies and cost savings are significant. So I don't want to lose that. The FTE for Amanda, which is the Amanda applications, I'm curious why it's 1 FTE and it's $160,000 annually for 2 years.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure if Jason or one of his team would have the information.
Yeah, an application analyst is what we're looking for, but that's a lot of money for an application analyst.
So through the chair, that's an existing position that we have on the Amanda team. Right now we have a team of, I believe it is 5 who are getting the Amanda system up and running across the department. So they've been focusing to date. We have most of our building permit process on Amanda, and we're piloting right now the digital applications. In 2019, the focus will be on planning and engineering approvals, and you'll see there is a capital project item related to re-engineering some of those processes to have them ready for transferring to digital applications. Most likely getting into 2020, early 2021 by the time we're ready to have digital applications in planning and engineering.
Okay, so I didn't hear the justification for the $160,000 for 1 FTE. Sorry.
So through the chair, that's salary and benefits for that level of position. I'd have to go back and check if there was some additional software licensing, those sorts of costs built into that number as well.
If you could provide that, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And I just had one more, Mr. Chair, on the roads budget. So I understand that the gross figure in the roads budget for 2019 would encompass everything that's budgeted plus even if it's paid for like by development charges or for the provincial government or federal. So all money, that's the total pot of money, which is $96 million. And then that the net of $56 million is just the levy portion, correct?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's correct. And those other funding sources, as the councillors identified, does include development charges or what we refer to as contributions from reserves as it relates to the growth-related projects. Federal gas tax funding is a principal funding source as well, about $28 million, as well as previous year surpluses from favorable tendering and projects that are no longer a priority being closed out, and those funds are applied to the roads budget as well. So as the councillors identified, the gross investment is just short of $97 million and $56 million to be funded from the levy.
Thank you. So in the budget report, it shows $55 million, which is the levy. What portion of $55 million is committed to road maintenance and repair, excluding bridges, sidewalks, lighting, and traffic? So just getting our roads in better shape how much of that 55 million is for roads specifically?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we can confirm the number. I thought it was somewhere around 44 million just for roads, but we'll confirm that number.
And can I also get the annual road maintenance and repair infrastructure deficit, just roads, not bridges and sidewalks and everything, just the roads? Do we know that number? Or can we get that?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll provide that number, and then we'll provide you, if where the council's going is, we can provide the ratio as well. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure if Gord has that figure.
So through the chair, to you, Councillor. This year, the investment in the state of good repair, which would be the replacement program, urban rehab, rural rehab, and ops and maintenance, we're going to invest gross about $51.6 million, which is a net of 37 in 2019. But some of that work, as Mike has pointed out, is from some WIP funding and a few other of the programs.
So from the city levy, it's $37 million for road repair.
That's correct.
And do we know the annual road infrastructure deficit?
Currently, the best indicator would be the benchmark reinvestment rate. The roads asset is worth around $5 billion. The Canadian Infrastructure Report Card recommends a 2 to 3% reinvestment rate, which is in the neighborhood of around $100 million at the low end. So we're investing 52 gross back into it, so the deficit would be the difference between those two.
Okay, thank you for that. You can go back to me later on that issue. Thank you.
Good questions. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mike. Mike, I watched with interest through the previous presentations and then today, and I noticed you had one slide there for housing, and it was the, if you can go back to that. So I'm looking at housing services there, so it's restated to 11 million and we're down to 7.5, and if I could just get an explanation on that, on the discrepancy between those two numbers, that'd be great, and then I have some questions.
Sure. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I recall the funding sources for 2019, and we might have to identify what is beyond Council's previous commitment through the Poverty Reduction Social Housing Strategy. The $77.5 million really represents $7 million from the $50 million 10-year commitment. $500,000 is what we refer to as block funding. It's part of the capital levy. And you would have recalled last week a figure of $8 million because there's another $500,000 in City Housing Hamilton block funding. So the overall investment's $8 million capital. In terms of 2018, maybe Brian has the answer in terms of beyond the Poverty Reduction Social Housing Strategy and block, what the other funding source was in 2018.
Yeah, so through the chair, there's an additional, we doubled up the Hamilton Future Fund money in the 2018 budget, so that's what the difference is.
Okay, thanks for that. So this is, the capital budget process always reflects the investments that we get from other levels of government. And, last year and the year before, I had complained that we basically have a housing funding strategy, and it's almost a go-it-alone policy because we really haven't received additional resources from our partners at both the federal and provincial governments. I have to give credit to the former provincial government. They had from time to time given us some strategic investments for housing. Of course, with the new government, that funding stream has certainly dried up with the removal of the cap and trade and the resources that were associated with that. But the other partner is the federal government, and of course in 2017 they released a national housing strategy, and as part of that strategy they created the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, where they announced billions and billions of dollars over a 10-year period that would be made available not only to municipalities but to all stakeholders and entities that form part of the housing services industry. And so I had asked earlier this year in terms of what have we received to date as part of that plan, and I have had some informal discussions with staff through you, Mr. Chairman, around applications that may or may not have been made. And what I've heard informally is that the application process is a difficult one to not just to apply for, but to receive the funds. And so it's very the criteria that they've established makes it very difficult to secure funding, put it that way. And so their goal was to build, I think it was 60,000 new units. They had a goal of repairing 240,000 units. And so when the strategy was released, it was music to certainly our ears, I think, knowing the building condition assessments that we've created over the last number of years, where many of our units are 40 or 50 years old, and we're essentially in a crisis situation. And our council is going to receive, and the community is going to receive, hopefully soon, a memo from City Housing. Our annual budget is just over $8 million, and 55% of our funds for 2019 will be spent on 2 buildings where we're dealing with asbestos. So it's not something that's discretionary. It's a health and safety issue. Those buildings are in my ward. We've met with the tenants already. They understand the plan. But I think it highlights the fact that, you know, here we are spending 55% of our entire budget for 2019 on 2 buildings that will get us no further along with our building assessments, will not create any new units. And so as I've watched the capital budget information that's been presented over the last couple of weeks now, I've been waiting to see some line in there that suggests that the federal government, as part of the strategy and the resources that they've announced and celebrated, I was waiting to see something highlighted in our book, and I don't see that. And so I'm wondering what the strategy is in terms of, I had asked for a report that was going to illustrate some of the complexities and difficulties related to the application process. I know that Adam and Paul are aware of that, and I don't know if that comes back as part of this budget process, but I think there needs to be something from this council that says we're making our way through 2019. Obviously, there's an election on the horizon. That's usually, unfortunately, when the checks flow, is just during the election year. But something needs to change for us because the go-it-alone strategy isn't working, and we all know that, you know, fixing the affordable housing problem that we have in this community won't be done by one entity alone, the municipality. So I know I'm venting a little bit. There's a couple of questions there. I guess the first question would be, when does that report come to this committee and council so we can have a very in-depth discussion on what our relationship is with the federal government and what plan do we have to secure funding as part of that strategy?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I believe Paul is going to try to answer that, and I'll ask Paul if he can include reference to what the infrastructure deficit figure is for housing, because it is fairly telling in terms of what's required in the next 10 years, and the fact that municipalities will not necessarily have the funding capacity or tools to endeavor to do that alone.
I think, Councillor, the Mayor would also like to chime in on this particular topic. And to your points, once Paul provides an answer, if you're okay with that. Okay, Paul, first.
Through the Deputy Mayor, I mean, right now we're looking at just over $200 million infrastructure deficit around housing. That's projected to grow to some $600 million plus in the coming years. So there's a significant deficit in there. Like most infrastructure the city struggles with, our housing infrastructure is no different. It is aging. We do not have enough money on a yearly basis, and the councillor has raised a significant issue around these buildings were built at a particular time, a lot of them, and really what we need is a full rehabilitation of these buildings. That's impossible given the money we have, so we put together the best we can. And unfortunately, we have situations like City Housing Hamilton is dealing with asbestos remediation. Those are expensive projects that just have to get done for life safety issues, and it uses up all the money for 1 year. I will say that only 2 of the projects, we had more, but only 2 projects met the criteria for submission under the federal program that Councillor was mentioning. One of those was in the community. It's the YW project, and the second was the City Housing Hamilton project. I can't tell you right now, we don't have the formal results of those applications, so I can't say whether they are good to go or not. We're confident in those projects, but we don't have the formal yes. We have been in constant communication with our federal staff representatives to let them know that we found the process of applications to be very difficult. Simply put, the projects needed to be so far along that it made it difficult. We had several good projects with lots of other funding in place, and we just weren't able to meet the criteria. So we're continuing to work at a staff level. Some of the information that the councillor has talked about will be part of our budget presentation from an operating perspective, and then a full report. I've asked that to happen very quickly in the new year, and as you know, we've just hired a new director of housing, and Vicky and Edward will work at that transition and get that information in a formal report. But I can tell you I'm not waiting for that to happen. I'll build some of that into my budget presentation on January the 18th.
Sure, go ahead. No, go ahead, if you want to.
I just want to add, when we set aside our $50 million, which was the right thing to do, it was also predicated on additional revenues coming from the province and the feds, and they've made it enormously difficult to advance that through their process. So I'm hoping that we can actually have some specific reporting on where the challenges are, so we can take it to FCM. I think this is the year that we need to start soon advocating for a release of some of those funds in a more strategic way on behalf of the federal government. So Big City Mayors Caucus and FCM, I think, would be very interested in having this as an agenda item so that we can actually weigh in with the government to really talk about the specific challenges that we're facing in terms of the application process. So Chad's been on this, and we all have been, in fact, that they've been really lax in terms of getting this money out. Great announcements in terms of overall numbers. Very little has gone out to communities in terms of projects. So if we can find some very specific items that would help free up the process, I'd be happy to take that to the Big City Mayors Caucus and then through them through FCM, and have that part of one of our main objectives in terms of the upcoming election, for sure.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you for that, and I look forward then to Paul's presentation, certainly Vicky's and Edward's as well. And I think we need a supplemental list, excuse me, that says, because my fear is, 2019 is the election year, then we go through this process all over again. Funds are then, parked to the side, and we got to wait for 3 or 4 years to get checks again while people are poised to knock on doors and try to get reelected. And that's just the nature of provincial and federal politics, unfortunately, but that's something we're stuck with. So I don't want to lose the momentum going into 2019, knowing that there's an opportunity to take advantage of a public statement from our council. And obviously we have a lot of people on the sidelines here locally who feel the same way in terms of other housing providers. It's not just city housing. And of course our tenants who are anxious to see their units repaired. And those people sitting on the wait list are anxious to see new units open so they can finally get a place to call home. So I would like to see that presentation, and sorry, back to my point on the supplemental list, I would like to see a list of projects, whether they're City Housing Hamilton or other providers locally, who are anxious to see repairs, renovations, and or resources for new units, where we could then, as part of this conversation, advocate for those initiatives and those dollar amounts. I'm unclear right now in terms of if the application process was an easier process. I'm not certain how many, there's no limit to how many projects locally where there's a need, but in terms of a strategic plan, whether it's half a dozen projects or more, something along the lines of, here's the list, here are the projects we're advocating for, and when there are local MPs then are making the rounds, and invariably sometimes they end up in this council chamber, we'll make a very informed decision and have a discussion around key specific projects instead of talking in generalities about large sums of money in the billions of dollars. So those are my comments. I'm sorry to vent again, but I didn't want to lose the opportunity to raise housing again. And of course, you will see that, hopefully that memo from City Housing in the next couple of weeks that highlights the dilemma that we're in terms of 55% of our annual budget for capital will be allocated to just 2 buildings. So thanks for the time.
Can I very quickly, Councillor Collins, just take the chair real quick, to Paul. So the Y you said, and I'm sorry, what was the other project through you that did qualify? 500 McNabb? Okay. So there are other projects, both by City Housing Hamilton and other providers, that have begun. They're at various stages, albeit mostly can be defined preliminary. And what I heard you say in answering both Councillor Collins and talking to Mayor Fred on this is that the application process is onerous and you need to be at some stage of development. So can we also pinpoint or asterisk when you provide this list that I think is rightly being asked for by Councillor Collins of potential projects, City Housing Hamilton or otherwise, those ones who are closer to being eligible with respect to this onerous application process through you? Because there's more than 2 or 3 out there.
Through the chair, absolutely, and I think the approach that the councillor was indicating is exactly the way we think too. You have to prioritize these. So some are in the idea stage, but others are very much more real, and some that we have allocated local resources to support, and we're happy to do that if these projects can move forward. So that list and the way that it was presented, we're going to build that right into our presentation, because I think that's the key moving forward, is we have the ability, and we actually have a great resource that council has supported over the year to provide us in terms of resources to make both renovations happen, but more importantly some of these new builds so that we can actually add additional units to the city.
Thanks, Paul, and hi, Vicky. Thank you, Vicky. Okay, I'll take the chair back, and I still have, unless on this, Mike, you have anything further, and then Councillor Jackson.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll just remind committee, and we touched upon this last week, is the application-based approach to funding to municipalities continues to be a barrier as it relates to actually achieving the outcomes that all levels of government want to achieve. I would say the one relationship we do have with senior levels of government that works effectively is the gas tax revenue sharing, whereby they identify categories that can be invested in. And for the benefit of the new councillors, when that program was initially initiated, there was an audit process at the end where an independent auditor would confirm that the city made investments as per the criteria of the program. I just simply would suggest is that that model really applies itself well to achieving outcomes in a more timely manner, maybe a little less administrative cost and burden. And again, that is a model, a relationship that currently exists, and I know that a number of municipalities would hope that senior levels of government would turn to that relationship on a go-forward basis as it relates to other funding programs. And I would simply also add, I'm quite confident if Councillor Morla was here, he would remind us all that social housing is a cost for municipalities in Ontario only. No other jurisdiction in North America funds social housing through local taxpayers.
Thank you. On behalf of Councillor Marula, Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Just, Mike, just some questions for clarification or confirmation, please. On this particular slide, forestry and horticulture, including tree planting, do we know where the traffic island beautification program falls in? Would it fall in under that line item? I'm not looking for details, but I'm just curious. Or would it fall in under the roads, bridges, sidewalk, street lighting, traffic? Any idea where that might fall in, Mr. Deputy Mayor? I don't want to lose sight of that excellent program.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I see Craig making his way to the microphone.
And as Director Murdoch is making his way to the microphone, for my new colleagues, that's the traffic island, the concrete island conversions to beautification of flowers and shrubs and horticulture that, in my humble opinion, have been benefiting our community from an image standpoint, have been very well received. Craig,
Speaking
please.
on behalf of all other wards but 6, since all of yours are done now, I think he's ready.
Thank you for the editorial, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Craig?
Through the chair, yes, that is where horticulture is found in that line. But for 2019, there are no traffic island conversions identified.
Okay, so thank you, Craig, for stating that. So maybe Craig in future, as the budget deliberations might continue, could possibly Craig bring a list? There must be an outstanding list, to my knowledge. I know I've still got a couple in my ward that haven't been converted. If other colleagues wish to also possibly advocate for some in their wards. I believe there was an inventory of locations across the entire city that were candidates eligible for conversions. Craig, do you have that composite list, and possibly could it make its way during the budget deliberations? Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you.
Through the Deputy Mayor, yes, we have that list, and we can bring it forward for future deliberations.
Perfect, thank you, appreciate that. Mike, transit services, I'm only asking, does that amount include DARTS, or DARTS is separate from that, Mike, from that amount?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll turn to staff. believe DARTS is an operating contractual obligation unless there are any vehicles that the city, but typically the obligation for vehicles is a lease obligation of the provider. So I would say no.
All right.
Debbie is nodding her head. Yes, that's correct. No?
Okay, no capital there for DARTS in that line item. Thank you. Let's see here. Long-term care facilities, acting city manager are 2, second to none. Wentworth and Macassa Lodge facilities, the municipality owns and operates. We're continuing that $500,000 a year earmarked for, if you will, putting in a reserve for future capital improvements. Mike, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, a number of years ago, Council started that process is to direct $500,000 in operating transfers to reserve, and that is continuing now.
Thank you. Area rating wards 1 to 8. I read your footnote in the budget, capital budget booklets, Mike, about just wanting to have a chance to review. So in my Ward 6, there was a slight realignment, but obviously it was entirely within the urban district of the Mountain. So for me, I would imagine that the Ward 6 area rated fund will be a wash, it'll be similar. But are there areas of our city where it crossed over into the suburban parts and there might be changes? Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to Mike, is that why you want to bring back a report?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that is one of the reports that are outstanding as it relates to ward realignment. Is I would identify 2 factors as it relates to the capital reinvestment area rating reserve. One is the realignment of the boundaries within the former City of Hamilton boundary. The second is the inclusion of some former suburban or non-City of Hamilton properties within the new wards. So recognizing that the area rating funds are levied onto previous City of Hamilton properties, is currently there is a matching obligation that those funds be reinvested into infrastructure investments benefiting those property owners. So one of the policy decisions we will have to make on a go-forward basis is whether that continues or whether properties that are outside of what used to be the former City of Hamilton could benefit from those investments, recognizing they are not contributing into those funds. So 2 factors. One is the realignment within the former City of Hamilton. The second factor is the inclusion of some former non-City of Hamilton properties, and how do we treat those properties as it relates to the potential for reinvestment.
Okay, Mike, thanks for clarifying, making that distinction. Obviously, your latter point is probably going to be the little trickier one. Page 7, slide 7 there, Mike. Parkland acquisition, something I have constantly fought for. Do we know what our total amount is, or is the 1.5 million literally brand new in terms of that we pretty well depleted what was formerly there? Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that is not the balance on the reserve, but we can provide that information to Council. And I would also add is we'll provide you some sense as to what projects we see on the horizon, so you get a better appreciation as to what the balance or status of that reserve may be on a go-forward basis.
Excellent, Acting City Manager. Lastly, slide 12. As a newly appointed member of the Police Services Board with Councillor Collins, thank you again to my colleagues. I take it that pretty well this is the budget submitted for capital improvements, and I know you can't speak for the board, Mike, and our first meeting for Councillor Collins and I believe will be next Thursday, but I guess this has already been recommended, it's done, and there's really no review of it, if you will, Mr. Deputy Mayor, for the new board.
Item 6.1 coming up next. We'll be able to with the police board.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I'll just speak to it quickly. You do have agenda item 6.1, which is the recommendation from Hamilton Police Services Board with respect to their 10-year capital budget.
That's what I'm getting at. It's already recommended. That's what I'm getting at.
By the board, yes. And so what we have presented as part of the preliminary capital budget is what was earmarked for 2019 in 2018, which is $400,000. With respect to the 4 projects that are identified in the slide 12, you'll see a breakdown in 2019 funding requirements as well as funding requirements in 2020. If we work down that list of 4, the overall investment for 2019 would represent about $1.5 million, so about $1.1 million over and above what we have funded as part of the preliminary 2019 capital. And if council were to approve this amount, we would have to revise our financing strategy for 2019. Again, the gap is what was identified for 2019 in 2018, which is $400,000, and the revised list of projects and roof repairs being a principal one, as well as some investments into technology, as well as the tasers that are end of life, and some HVAC investments. So what I want to highlight right now, or this morning, is the fact that if approved by council, we will have to revise our capital financing strategy to accommodate potentially an additional $1.1 million.
Thank you for all that, Mike. So I would hope then that we're not going to approve 6.1 today, that along with the follow-up capital budget meeting in late January, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I would, at least as a new board member, love to delve into the capital projects with police services, and hopefully if we table this, we still have a good month as we're looking at the overall citywide capital budget deliberations, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and that will at least give me a chance further to ask the questions I need to at the board table.
Right.
Thanks for all your answers, Mike. Much appreciated.
Yeah, we in all likelihood will be deferring to January 21st, and that would mean, I'm sure, item 6.1. And good questions. Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Mike. I'm just, as a newbie, I'm just trying to understand the roadmap ahead of you. So if I had a question, for example, Councillor Jackson was raising the traffic islands and things like that, and he raised a question about the ash tree program. When do those become deliberated?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we have our original schedule. Last week we suggested amending it to allow for some additional time for capital budget deliberations. We have our next check-in on the tax capital budget is January 21st, and I believe that is our only remaining GIC before it would go to council. And I'll turn to Stephanie because I'm not sure what our January, whether that would hit our January council or our February council.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, if it goes to the January 21st, it would hit the January 23rd council for the capital budget.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if there are questions, I would again invite council members to reach out to staff if you have questions leading up to January 21st.
Okay.
Feel free to either send an email or request a meeting with staff to either get a better appreciation of scope of work on some of the projects or a better understanding as to timing of projects.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, if that's okay. Just in terms of understanding the process going forward, overall, how and when do we have that discussion of the amount of debt that we're possibly going to incur with growth infrastructure? What triggers that?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we can bring that information back on January 21st. We had some slides last week. We can bring that information back, and if the councillor has some specific questions with respect to what projects are driving the debt, I would suggest there's a couple of factors. It's the pace of development that we assume that would be driving the debt, and so we can share with you how many single detached units and how many square feet of non-residential we are assuming to give you a better understanding as to the pace of growth that is driving that debt, as well as the overall scope of projects that are driving that the debt. I'll also add, beyond the budget process, is our currently we're in the midst of preparing our development charge background study, which will inform our next bylaw, which must be updated by January or July, first week of July in 2019. So again, There'll be additional information with respect to the development charge background study that will be coming to council as well, and that will give you a sense as well as to how the growth forecasts are impacting the level of services, as well as I'll just reference that there have been some legislative changes that allows municipalities to capture more of the costs around transit and waste diversion, that as well as impacting the forecast going into 2019 as relates to development charges.
I'm just trying to understand, and I will, of course, be the poster child for our infrastructure deficit along with climate change, and I'll wear those two labels proudly. An infrastructure deficit of $3.7 billion, an annual backlog of $195 million, a capital forecast shortfall, all of which is we're betting the house on some population projections that we're not going to meet. And I'm trying to understand the sequence of this discussion, that if I approve a capital budget here, that I'm not approving a pattern of residential development that is unsustainable and the costs that are associated with it. So I'm trying to figure out what triggers what, because with the greatest of respect to the speakers that have preceded me in other days, saying that our infrastructure deficit is a consequence of A, senior orders of government no longer being in the business of city building, and B, our infrastructure is aged, I would suggest, and that's what this budget does suggest. It suggests that we have grown and developed in such a way that it's not sustainable. And it says that our future investments are just going to continue that pattern. And we're looking at a whole lot of debt, which is going to fall on the backs of my children and yours. And I just want to know, when do we have that discussion about these investments?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I would say we can start having some additional information brought to Council as it relates to 2019 to 22, as it relates to those projects that are specifically required in order to provide the services to enable growth going forward. So you have a better understanding as to what projects are driving the development charge funded debt. And I want to be careful when I refer to development charge funded debt, because you'll see in the report that because of a number of factors, legislation that does not allow municipalities to fully recoup the cost of growth from development charges, some of our own discretionary exemptions. I believe the report identifies that about 70% of growth is funded, of growth-related projects are funded from development charges. The balance, 30%, are funded from rate and taxpayers. So I just want to be careful and expand on the reference to DC funded debt, because for some they may feel that, well, if it's funded from development, there's no risk to existing taxpayers, ratepayers. Well, that's not true for a number of factors. A is growth does not pay for growth. B is that because of our exemption programs, as well as we've identified this year, as in previous years, we don't necessarily align the budget with Places to Grow. While planning has to align their planning documents with the Places to Grow forecasts, we recognize the risk of doing so because of the pace of growth we've actually recognized and realized in the past. If I look at the residential side, we are probably about 800 single detached units short each and every year relative to Places to Grow. On the non-residential side, Places to Grow somewhere in the area of 2 million square feet on the non-residential, and we're averaging about 1 million square feet. So for budget purposes, and I want to emphasize this for the benefit of committee and council, is we budget according to what we expect we will realize from growth, not necessarily what is projected for growth under Places to Grow. The risk of doing that, of aligning with Places to Grow, is we could oversize a significant amount of infrastructure and burden existing taxpayers and ratepayers with the servicing of that infrastructure until such time as the development is realized. So again, we can try to provide some additional information to the councillor and bring some of that back to our January 21st, just so that you have a better appreciation as to what projects are driving the development charge, reflected debt, and what risks there may be with respect to that debt on a go-forward basis.
Excellent. Councillor Wilson, thank you very much. Councillor Danko is next.
Deputy Mayor, slide 6, I'm going to start with a question on planning and development. When I delve into the specific projects deeper, there's a line item there for parking payment equipment. It's $100,000 in 2019, and then I believe it's around $100,000 each subsequent year moving forward. Is that specifically for changing coin-operated parking meters to credit card or smartphone payment? Or
Jason? Or Ryan? Yes. Ryan Holmesworth is our director, and he is acknowledging indeed that is the case.
And is that an acceptable amount of money to get that done?
Ryan, you might as well come down. I think Councillor Danko's hit on something very good, and a little history lesson might not hurt either.
Through the chair, there's also amounts in previous years in addition to that $100,000. And I'm proud to say that the RFP for the credit card machines closed last week, and we've received some good bids.
Thank you. Round of applause. No, I just wanted to make sure that was on the long-term plan. Second question, under roads, bridges, sidewalks, I'm trying to find where specifically cycling infrastructure is included in the capital plan there. So I see for 2019 there's a budget of, I believe it's $300,000 for on-street bikes facilities. But then when I go to the 10-year plan, there's nothing for 2019, nothing for 2020, and then 350 subsequent years. Is there other places in the capital plan where cycling infrastructure is included? And is that a discrepancy between 2019, 2020, and the amounts budgeted moving forward?
Through the chair, again, Brian Hollingworth. The $300,000 has been a historical amount and carries through. In addition to that, there are amounts for cycling embedded in other projects, and we can quantify that as required, but it is a significant amount. And on top of that, for the next 2 years, the city received $3.9 million from the Ontario Municipal Cycling Infrastructure Fund, which is on top of all that. So it is in different accounts. The $300,000 account is just the historical base account.
Okay, Steve, did that cover it? Did you want to say anything else? You're good?
I would just maybe suggest then, for my interest, to get an idea overall what we're investing on cycling infrastructure as a total amount through all projects for 2019. That's something I'd be able to present to the community to make sure that it's in line with our long-term plans for cycling infrastructure.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll track that and we'll bring that back on January 21st.
Thank you.
Excellent. Good questions. You would be second time, Councillor Clark, and so would Mayor Fred, so we'll go to Councillor Clark.
Thank you, appreciate that. So just to recap what I heard earlier, so 2019, $37 million from the levy is the amount that is for roads, repairs, maintenance alone, with $52 million gross from other levels of government and DCs, so $28 million from the gas tax, and then the DCs are applied for any growth-related expenditure over the $37 million. But then the city also is required, out of that 37 million, a certain portion would be used for growth infrastructure as a result of, right? So the 37 million for repairing roads is even a little bit lower because the growth repairs may not actually be repairs. They could be widenings. They could be any number of things.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the councillor is correct. I think what the councillor is capturing is our previous conversation around development charge exemptions. When we have to exempt a road project or there is a benefit to existing, that portion of that project is funded from the levy. So again, we can try to provide that breakdown to committee so that you have a better appreciation as to what I'll call state of good repair, dollars that are going towards existing roads versus dollars, some net funding that is going towards growth-related roads because of development charge exemptions and because of benefit to existing.
That would be really helpful, and I would like to ask that we actually get that number, so that the state of good repair for roads exclusive of federal money, provincial money, and DC portions, so we know exactly what we're talking about in terms of improving our roads. I heard staff indicate that the total annual road deficit is projected at the low end, in quotations, of 100 million annually. And it would be helpful if I actually had a copy of the background report that helped them arrive at that. So do we do that assessment, or is that an assessment that's being done by a third party, and what that report looks like? So if I could perhaps get that and perhaps share it with any other councillors for sure. And how do we assess the road infrastructure deficit? What's our capital planning like in terms of actually reaching out, looking at our roads' current state of repair, and here's what we need to do, here's what we can afford to do. I'm not familiar with the policy on that, so that would be helpful. And then finally, I'd like to know if there is a long-term capital plan to address that deficit. I mean, I've heard many councillors for well over a couple of decades talk about the deficit. It seems to be more prominent these years. But how are we looking at a deficit annually of $100 million on the low end just to repair the roads, and we're only spending out of taxpayers' pocket $37 million minus whatever the development charge portion is? It doesn't look like we're ever going to catch up with that scenario, and so I would like to see what the plan would be, and perhaps Dan could help me out here in understanding exactly where we are.
Absolutely.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I guess a couple of things there. We're certainly happy to provide that information to you, and the numbers that we were sharing with you this morning are related to the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card and the methodology that they use around what's sustainable funding for roads. I think the conversation that we're going to have with committee and council throughout 2019 as it relates to Bill 6 and the asset management regulations is going to force us to have a more meaningful conversation. And I know that Gord and I have talked a number of times about creating more visibility for committee around things like cycling lanes, like what is state of good repair, what's an enhancement to the system, so that you can see it's broken down in a more meaningful way. When we talk about the infrastructure deficit or the backlog, currently our overall road condition index is around 62. So if council was to say we're happy with a 50, then we don't have any backlog. I don't think anybody's content with the 62. I think many of you heard that during the election, that 62 is not something that the community appears to be on for. So if we want to elevate that to 70 or 75, now we have a backlog or we have a significant deficit. So there's a lot of nuance to it, and the asset management kind of body of knowledge is still evolving as well. And so Gord and I have it on our work plan to bring back better information for committees so we can have a more meaningful conversation. We're going to have to do it as a result of Bill 6 anyway. But we're hopeful that throughout 2019 we can bring you information that's going to be more informative for you.
So help me out. The 62 represents what?
That's through you, Mr. Chair. That's the overall condition index of our entire road network. So that means, and it's essentially a grade out of 100. So some of our roads are around 80, 85. Obviously, the ones that have been rehabilitated recently, but that means that there's also many of them that are down around 40 and 30 and that kind of thing. So through the Bill 6 requirements over a period of time, council will have to establish what is that level of service that they want to provide to the community, and then the idea would be that our financing strategies would have to line up with achieving that level of service.
In addition.
So just to jump in, I think to the councillor's question around a sustainability plan, we have no financial sustainability plan for roads. What Dan's identified as it relates to the exercise we will go through with this term of council is a policy paper with respect to our assets and a service standard for assets with a financing plan. To maintain that 62% condition index, I believe Public Works reported back in 17 or 18, it would require additional about 28 million annually just for roads. That would represent a 3% property tax increase just to maintain our current status, our condition for roads. That is the difficult conversations we will have to have in 2020 and 2021 with council as it relates to how are we going to address our infrastructure deficit in general, because that conversation will go beyond roads. It will include our facilities, our corporate facilities, our recreation facilities, and our other asset classes as well.
Okay. If I could just get those answers to those questions at the appropriate time, I'd really appreciate that. Be happy to meet too. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Fred, second time.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to the meter card and phone payment. I was hoping to catch Brian while I was still sitting there, but I want to be clear about where they're going. So presumption might be that they're going to be done everywhere. I don't think that's quite accurate, but we've been pushing this along, and happy to hear that we're at that point where we can get some conversions happening sooner rather than later. So Brian, in terms of where the conversions are going to happen, can you kind of outline where we see these investments now happening and where we are still going to be deficient and on meters, the old classic one-arm meter. I don't know, what do you call those things actually? Just a meter. Yeah, probably. Everything has a nickname. This one doesn't. But anyway, can you kind of outline where they're going to be and where they're not going to be and how we're going to roll that out in the future?
Yes, please do, through the chair. So the RFP I referenced that closed last week is to convert the coin-operated pay and display machines in the surface lots to accommodate credit cards, which is critically important. And we've requested 70 machines, so basically enough to cover every surface lot in the city. In parallel, we are working on an application for pay by phone, so you'll be able to come up to a parking meter and either have the option of putting in coins or paying through your smartphone, and that is imminent as well early in the new year.
So is that then take care of all the meters that are out there in terms of conversion?
The pay by phone app is quite convenient to implement because it's really just a sticker on a meter, right, and with some back-end payment things, but we won't be upgrading every old meter head to accommodate a credit card because we think there will be a move for people to use pay by phone.
Okay, so just to be clear, so at a given date, we're going to have both credit card availability on the existing machines, and we're going to have phone pay availability on all the other meters are out there by what date?
Credit card payment and phone payment in surface lots and structures where appropriate. I will say probably by February, March, if all goes well. We put an 8-week delivery time on the delivery of the payment machines, and pay by phone. I won't commit to anything precisely, but we are advancing that really quickly with a potential vendor and see it being implemented certainly within Q1 or Q2 of next year.
Okay.
And that'll cover every meter in the city.
Then everything is done. Okay, brilliant. That's great. That's fantastic. Great news. I'm sure it'll make a lot of users happy. They don't have to scramble for coins anymore, and certainly would make this person happy. Thank you.
And a big part of past expenses, Brian, I'll just note, you don't have to comment, I believe, just nod. The enforcement officers need the tech to support enforcement of this new tech, and that's already in place, previously budgeted. And that is it for questions. And thank you, Mike. We will move to receive the presentation at this time. Councillor Ferguson, Councillor Vanderbeek, all in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, I have an indication from Councillor Wilson.
Sorry, just had one point of clarification.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Point of clarification.
On the process, at what point in this conversation do we ask about specific departmental asks here?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, staff are available today. If there are specific questions on detail sheets, you'll have, just as a reminder to all councillors, is you would have received two books. Book one is a summary with some summary tables. Book two is your light reading. That is a comprehensive list of projects we refer to as detail sheets. Within the detail sheets, you'll get a brief description of the project. You'll get a sense as to what the investment represents, as well as the financing strategy. So again, staff are available today. Between today and January 21st, staff will be available. If you have any questions, I would invite you to reach out either through an email or request a meeting if you, again, are looking to gain a better appreciation for the scope of work or the timing or any additional information. And I would expect staff would be here again on January 21st to answer any further questions that you might have. But I would encourage all councillors between now and the 21st to start those conversations just to move the process along in case you are requiring information that staff will have to compile. And if that takes a few days, it'll just help to move the process along.
There's a great advantage. Thank you for the question, Councillor, for clarification. And there's a great advantage to the what we seek now, which is a deferral of this report to the January 21st, 2019 meeting. Before I do that, though, two possible notices of motion from Councillor Ferguson, and I know you want to get to a pressing policing event, so if you would like, we could move the notices now, and I'll give you the floor. If you indicate, I will activate. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. There is a Chamber of Commerce meeting in Ancaster. I'm a speaker at noon. We may get there anyway, but thank you for allowing me to put these two notices before you now. And they're both just going to remain notices of motion. The first one is that the operating impacts of the 2019 capital budget be parked until the operating budget is approved. However, the financing, the cost of the ambulances be included in the capital budget. And I hope, Mike, I got those words close. And you can work with Stephanie to get it exact when it comes back as a motion. And the second notice, Mr. Chairman, is that the $38 million non-funded capital for West Harbour be funded from the $42 million in expected gains for the sale of the West Harbour lands. And once again, I would expect Mike and Stephanie to tweak that as necessary when it comes back as a motion, but I think you can hear the intent.
Absolutely. We'll deal with them on the 21st. Much appreciated. So move then, unless someone wants to pass the capital budget here today, we'll move that we defer it to January 21st. Moved by Councillor Lloyd Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Nan. All in favor? Carried. Any opposed to that idea? Carries unanimously. Thank you to all the staff that were here for that important segment of today's meeting. If you don't need to be here now as we move toward the Police Services Board report, capital report, feel free to vacate as quietly as possible, please. Thank you. And we're on to discussion items, and we have one today, and it's item 6.1, Hamilton Police Services Board report. And I'm just looking for discussion on this item. We would have received this item, I believe, from Clerk Paparella last night. You sent this along, the report? Or do we want to just defer it to the 21st, along with the capital? If you want to talk to it now, you can do that as well. Councillor Clark looks like he's interested in asking a few questions.
Well, all I've received is the letter talking about 5.4, and then it talks about, it looks like 4 reports, but they're not appended to the letter, so I don't have the police services capital budget.
Madam Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the letter itself was all that I received, and that was included in the printed agenda, but you would have only received it a few days ago. There may be staff here to answer questions as well. I'm not sure if there's any, I see staff here from Hamilton Police Services that could also answer questions.
Who from Hamilton Police Services would like to come on up? And while you do, Mike Zagaric, it looks like you wanted to make a comment or two as well.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I just turned around and they've advised me that they can provide the reports to council, so we can work with Hamilton Police Services administrator and clerks and get you the background information as it relates to the projects.
Okay, if we could get that, that would be very helpful, because right now I don't have anything, so.
We want to ask when that can happen, knowing that we're meeting again on the 21st. We may actually pass the capital budget on the 21st, and so seeing that there are some additional capital projects than what we expected last time they were reported on, how much time will council have to review?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll work with Hamilton Police Services and clerks and try to have it to council early next week.
Does that sound good, Councillor? Go ahead.
Is the budget, will the budget be budget to budget, or will it actually show budget and actuals being spent in 2018 and what's proposed in 2019?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we can provide a comparison of what was submitted last year as it relates to the 10-year budget and what is being submitted to this council for the revised 10-year budget. So if I understand the councillor's question, if it's to compare what was submitted last year for 10 years versus this year for 10 years, we would have that information to share.
Yeah, no, my question is, diplomatically, it's the only budget that we receive that does not have the actual money that they spent. So we never see the actuals. We only see budget and compare it to budget. So they budgeted something for 2018 and then 2019. I don't know how we can deal with it without seeing the actual numbers that they spent. And this has been an ongoing issue for me. So I really would like to see the actuals so that we can compare and do our job.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if you allow us to take that away and we can see what reporting we can provide to council through Hamilton Police Services.
Thank you. Councillor Danko.
Thank you. Hopefully this is a simple answer. I noticed in the work, the capital work for West Harbour Pier 8, there is several $1 million for the relocation of the Marine unit. Just wondering why that's not on the police services capital expenditures. Maybe it's just an accounting thing.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it reflects the city made an obligation to Hamilton Police Services as part of the redevelopment to reestablish or create an alternate site. So again, the reason it's presented as a city project is that the city made the obligation to the service in order to develop on the existing space is to find an alternate space for the Marine unit.
Thank you.
Councillor Jackson.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, was the plan today that police services were possibly going to make a presentation on capital? I'm just asking, I'm curious, because I have a subsequent question to that. Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, not a presentation, but they are available to answer any questions as it relates to agenda item 6.1.
Thanks, Mike. I'm a little surprised that none of the senior command are here, either the chief or either one of the deputies. So maybe they are on very important matters involving city crime matters, so be it. And like Councillor Clark, I would have thought that those reports would have already been forthcoming at this time. So definitely looking to defer item 6.1, Mr. Chairman, because we need lots of time to look into it. Thank you.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, just as a reminder and an introduction for the new councillors is Hamilton Police Services comes forward to council as part of boards and agencies, so that will happen in the new year. In the past, we've dealt with capital as it relates to Hamilton Police Services in varied ways. Sometimes it's approved as part of the capital budget. Sometimes the projects are parked pending the overall budget presentation in the new year from Hamilton Police Services. So again, they will be before council to present their 2019 budget request as part of boards and agencies in the new year.
Mayor Fred.
So there is information in your agenda package on the capital budget increases. So there's no lack of information there. And we did defer, so not yet approved by Police Services because we deferred it to next month so the new members could participate in the discussion. So Councillor Collins and Councillor Jackson and myself will be at the upcoming board meeting, and broader discussion will happen on the capital budget at that time before it comes to council again. So I think that's probably why the senior command isn't here, because their expectation is that there's another presentation coming up down the road with questions. And so let's not be too critical on that point. And we will be reviewing the capital budget at the upcoming Police Services Board meeting. And I think it's scheduled for the 16th or 17th of January, prior to, well, we got one next Thursday, but there'll be another one in January. So we'll have a full review of that before it gets finalized and then brought here. You're welcome.
Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree with the previous several speakers, actually, comments, and if you'll come back to me, I'd like to move the motion to defer it. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Pauls.
Yes, I just want to ask, will the capital budget include the decision whether we opt in or opt out with marijuana? Because I know there will be incurred costs to all this, so I just want to know why we're not receiving it first, what it is, and is it included, what our decision is going to be made, and I think we have to make it by January 22nd?
Yeah, that's part of, it'll be more of an operating kind of...
well, the operating.
It's not a part of a capital, it's an
It's not capital of
more
the
of an enforcement
expenditure?
issue. Yeah. You know what, let Mike
I'm just...
answer your question. Sorry to ad-lib.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, committee will see in the report our financial impacts associated with the recommendation. The financial impacts have operating and a capital. I believe there's a vehicle that's required for bylaw. And what staff have identified in the report is that the cost would be offset by the revenue sharing commitments through the two-year phased approach as it relates to revenue sharing or financial sharing. So both capital and operating, but with offsetting revenue coming from the province and federal government.
Thank you.
Actually, a very good question, and I should have just went right to staff because you were right. Councillor Ferguson for the first time. Councillor Clark, can you turn your mic off? Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't want to jump in on this, but I just thought I'd provide clarity to members of council. The 2019 capital budget was approved by the board in November. That's what's before you in 6.1. It's very clearly laid out. And it sounds like there's a little disconnect from what Mike forecasted of 1.1 and what the actual ask is for 2019 is 1.4. But it's all there, all the various components and the description. And this is exactly what was approved by the board. I can tell you also that during the presentation of boards and agencies, that's when the chief will be before you, and typically he answers questions related to the operating and capital budget at that time.
Councillor Clark, second time.
Thank you. So my questions, I'm working from eScribe, so just so that everyone understands, and what I have in eScribe does not have the recommendation that is on Police Service Board memo. I'm not even sure if I'm supposed to have that because it's to the Police Services Board. But Councillor Pearson says it's in the book that we received. But I didn't have it because I'm trying to cut down on paper. And when I read the document here, it's not a budget. These are requests for funds. It's not an actual budget. So we have to approve a budget. So a little bit more information would still be helpful.
Councillor Partridge wanted to defer this to our January 21st capital budget meeting, and she'll need a seconder. Seconded by Mayor Fred Eisenberger. All in favor of that deferral? And on that, any notices of motion related to this capital budget other than the two that we allowed to sneak in a little earlier? None. So I will move at this time. Clerk.
Just for clarification, I realize that you do want to defer this matter, but does staff still want it referred to staff for a report back to January 21st? That's what we originally had.
That was, Councillor Clark had a number of questions that I saw nodding of the heads. We can take it as direction unless Councillor Clark wants to move it. I think staff got the message.
Okay.
No, it's okay. No, I think earlier you'll recall Councillor Clark's 3 items that he wanted more substance, and okay, you're good to deliver that? Mike?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll work with Hamilton Police Services and as it relates to any additional information that can be provided specific to the projects, as well as we will have to earmark something when we come back on January 21st. So we'll identify in our update what we are reflecting for a capital budget for Hamilton Police Services, and procedurally you will park that pending the January update. But again, we need to reflect somewhere in our capital budget some level of funding for Hamilton Police Services capital projects. So again, it will come back to you on January 21st. I just don't want you to be surprised why it's coming back on the 21st, just an amount being earmarked as a placeholder.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to mostly finance staff from Hamilton Police Services, and we'll see you again real soon. We appreciate that you came out here today. That's it. Who wants to adjourn? Ferguson and Collins. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries.